All right, well, we're about ready to resume our program here. I did want to take this opportunity once more to thank our sponsors who have made this event possible. We truly could not do it without them, and so we want to recognize them one more time. So we will start with our presenting sponsor, the Walton Family Foundation. Our platinum sponsor, Verizon. Our gold sponsors, the Georgia Charter Schools Association and Georgia Power. Our silver sponsors, Georgia EMC, Oglethorpe Power, and Georgia Transmission. Our bronze sponsors, General Building Maintenance, the Georgia Motor Trucking Association, the Heartland Institute, and the United Way of Greater Atlanta. Please join me in thanking our sponsors who truly make this happen. I also want to take this opportunity to recognize some folks who make this organization work on a daily basis. I want to start with our board members. I want to list them here. A couple of them have been able to join us today, but I want to recognize all of them. David Allman, Frank Barron, Gordon Beckham, Roy Fickling, Robert Hatcher, Kelly McCutcheon, Ray Padron, and Rogers Wade. We also operate with a lot of the intellectual work of our organization being done by our senior fellows. You've heard from a couple of them today. In addition to being a board member, Kelly McCutcheon is a senior fellow of ours, and Lynn Gilroy is one of our senior fellows as well, who you heard talking about pensions. And I want to recognize another of our senior fellows who's in the audience today, Eric Warren. So we could not provide the data and information and research that we produce without them, and so we're very grateful to them. And then I also want to recognize the rest of our staff. We are a very lean organization. There are only 3 of us employed by the foundation. And in addition to myself, we have our Vice President, Benita Dodd. Is Benita in here? Is she out there? She may be outside. Working to make the event go smoothly, and our office manager, Susan Benson. And then finally, I want to thank, we have a few volunteers here today. I don't want to miss anybody and leave them out, so I just want to thank them as a group for helping out. So please join me in giving a round of applause for our staff and our volunteers. All right, at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for lunch, Chuck Reed. His bio is in your program, so I don't want to go through it in a lot of detail, but what I think is important, he was the mayor of San Jose, California, and in that role, he produced a pension reform effort that really has been an inspiration for a lot of other jurisdictions around the country, and he has built on that by, since leaving office, being a member of the Retirement Security Initiative. That is a group that really encourages states and cities around the country to deal with their pension problems. They're one of the organizations that is looking at Georgia and trying to make sure that we here in this state are meeting our obligations and in a position to do so. And so we were very lucky to have Chuck come all the way from California to come and share some of the wisdom and lessons learned that he had from his experience and how we can apply that here in Georgia. So let's give Chuck a round of applause.
Thank you, Kyle. Well, I got to sleep in this morning. I didn't have to go to the breakfast session, but I know many of you got up early and were busy and probably missed the news. So I got to read the Wall Street Journal, And there was an interesting piece in there that I think is relevant to today's discussion. So the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, has recently identified a nationwide disorder of massive proportions. This disease is a psychological condition with fiscal impacts caused primarily from an overwhelming urge to overpromise and underfund retirement benefits. The most common symptoms are high taxes, increased borrowing, and deteriorating services. The condition is slow-moving but deadly. If left untreated, it will sap the body politic of its ability to lift a finger to respond to the needs of the people. Many state governments have been paralyzed by this disorder, but the federal government has shown little interest in action other than to give it a name, pensionitis. Unfortunately, that's kind of an exaggeration. The federal government hasn't even given it a name. The federal government is not going to help you. So, Georgia, you're on your own. Unless, of course, you think the Democrats are going to control both houses of Congress and the presidency soon, in which case Illinois and other big blue states will be asking for taxpayer bailouts. And so we'll raise your taxes in Georgia to bail out those plans. But nevertheless, pensionitis is real, even though the federal government doesn't necessarily recognize it. Before I get into the substance of my talk, I have some disclosures to make. I learned as a mayor and as a lawyer that it's better to get the disclosures out front, otherwise you get attacked for not having disclosed something. So first, let me say I'm a Democrat. I'm a Kennedy Democrat, and that's John, not Teddy. And some of you in the room are old enough to know the difference, to remember the difference. I even liked LBJ. I am also a CalPERS pensioner. That's the California Public Employment Retirement System's pensioner. I get a check every month. And I hope to get that check every month for the rest of my life and the life of my wife. And I want to make sure other CalPERS pensioners get the same. They get the benefits that they've earned. While I was mayor, I went to the ballot 4 times with tax increases. So I'm no stranger to tax increases. And I went to the ballot 3 times with pension reform. And we also did reform for OPEB, or post-employment benefits, in the form of retiree health care. I think defined benefit plans have a place in the retirement security and taking care of our employees. But I also recognize that defined benefit plans are unstable, inherently risky, and especially dangerous to local governments. While at the same time, I believe taxpayers should get a reasonable level of service for their taxes. Now, you might have noticed in the program that the title of my speech today is Keeping Promises and Protecting Taxpayers. And that's what makes it hard, trying to do both things at the same time. Part of what I'm doing, trying to keep promises and make sure that taxpayers get their benefit, is the work of the Retirement Security Initiative. We're a bipartisan advocacy organization, and I'm hoping the clicker is going to work. Well, that wasn't it. Am I going the wrong place? Wrong direction? I'm pushing the green button. Green means go. I'll let somebody work on that. You get to the beginning of my slides, and then I'll take over, and if we can't get there, I'll wing it. All right, this monitor here is not showing. There we go. Retirement security, that's us. I can see it fine. So we're a bipartisan advocacy group. We're working in about a dozen states around the country. Our directors and staffers have been involved in almost all of the major pension reform over the last decade. Our executive director is Pete Constant, who was one of my city council colleagues when we did pension reform in San Jose, and he's worked in other states as well. We have some reform principles, so when we come to a place like Georgia, we think about, well, what could Georgia do? And we apply our principles as we have in other states. And I'm going to come back to those later as they see how the fit into actually taking some action, but we work off principles. I want to give you a little bit of background about San Jose that explains what we did, how we did it, and what was the political driver. So first, wasn't really where I wanted to start. There's where I want to start. This is my one-page graphic of the fiscal time in office. I came into office as a council member a little to the left of that slide, and I left office as a mayor before we get to the end of that slide. But what was driving pension reform in San Jose was crowd out. We had 10 years of raising taxes and cutting services to balance the budget. You can see we had some pretty serious red ink. The last year is around $100 million, and that's on the general fund. And our spending in the general funds was roughly $800 million. So we had a shortfall of $100 million on $800 million spending. So we had a substantial gap. After 10 years of cutting services to balance the budget, I managed to convince my city council that it was time to do something directly about the costs. And we adopted a fiscal reform plan in 2011. We implemented it, and that included going to the voters with pension reform. As you can see, we stabilized the city budget, had a little bit of green, a little bit of red, but basically modest problems since then. We did several things in the fiscal reform effort. We consolidated, we got more efficient, we contracted out, we did pension reform, and we cut our employees' pay. Every employee in the city, including the mayor and council members, took a 10% pay cut. We got 7 of our 11 unions to agree to that, and 4 of them we had to impose on a 6-5 vote. So it wasn't easy, but we implemented the fiscal reform plan. You see, we stabilized the city and avoided service delivery insolvency. Now, things are not great in San Jose. Many levels of service are not back to where we established that we wanted to be, but we stabilized the situation. And pension reform is an important part of that. And why? Well, because our pension costs were going up and up and up and up and up with no end in sight. And they've gone up since then as well. As we put more and more money into pensions, there was less and less money available for community centers, parks, police officers, firefighters. It was squeezing every part of the budget, and even my liberal Democrats on the city council can see that we were squeezing the services that they cared about most. Now, San Jose is a Democrat city. We only had 1 Republican on the city council out of 10. That's all we allowed at the time. That was Pete Constant. And we're a Democrat city in a Democrat county, in a Democrat state, a deep blue Democrat state where the public employee unions are all powerful. But yet, as the pension costs increase and squeeze the services, my Democrats and I decided we had to take on the costs because these costs of pensions were driving the costs to a point where we couldn't afford to do the things that we really wanted to do. I mean, who wants to put money into pensions, right? That's for something out in the future, something's already done. Everybody wants to spend money on services today and tomorrow for the people they're trying to serve. My colleagues didn't get elected to cut the budget. They got elected to provide services, but yet they were cutting service even though the budget was going up. So we decided to take on the costs, and thus was born the effort to do pension reforms. Now, one interesting fact is that if you add up all of the red, the colored section under the line, it's about $1 billion. And at that time, our unfunded needs for infrastructure were about $1 billion. So we could have covered all of our infrastructure needs, but instead we put money into the pension system. So it was a significant burden. And all we were doing was just paying for promises that we had made. Now, the interesting thing about our plans is our plans had earned in excess of 7.5% since their inception. Yet we had billions of dollars of unfunded liabilities that were driving these costs. And as you work off your unfunded liabilities in Georgia, you know that the costs are going to go up. There's just no other way around it. More money has to go into the plan. So we went to the ballot with a pension reform in 2012. It was a big surprise, national news. Why was that? Well, because we're a Democrat city and a Democrat county and a Democrat state where the unions are all powerful, and yet we got nearly 70% yes vote from our voters. Now, I say nearly 70% because I'm accused of exaggerating if I say 70%, because it was really only 69.6%. So nearly 70% yes vote. We went to the voters 3 times on pension reform. That was the middle one, the most significant and the most difficult, but each time we got more than 2/3 of the vote yes. At the time we went, we were a AA+, a AA1 credit rating. We had never taken a pension holiday. We'd never failed to pay the ARC, and as I said earlier, our plans had earned in excess of 7.5% since their inception. We were the capital of Silicon Valley, 10th largest city in the country, and yet we had billions of dollars of unfunded liabilities that were driving these costs. So that's why we went to the voters. Now, let me talk about California. I'm from California. I'm here to help. I know you don't really appreciate that, but I'm not here how to tell you how to do what you need to do. I may be here to tell you how not to do what you're doing based on our California model, but you'll have to figure out for yourselves with the help of experts like Lynn Gilroy and the Reason Foundation, who we work with in many states. So here's the CalPERS. Now, CalPERS is the biggest pension plan in the country, biggest public employee pension plan in the country. They're also the smartest, the best, the most sophisticated, and if you don't believe that, just ask them. Now, what have they done with all of that smartness? Well, they've run a deficit. 17 years, I think. 17 years of failure. 17 years of failure to properly fund the promises that were made to our public employees. Now, in California, state employees are in CalPERS, and thousands of local jurisdictions have employees in CalPERS. So I say to CalPERS, why should we believe you when you tell us, don't worry, be happy, everything's going to be okay? 17 years of failure to deliver. Now, I ask you legislators and people, policy people in the room, what department of government would you accept 17 years of failure as, okay, it's going to be all right? I wouldn't do that as mayor, and 17 years of systemic failure. Now, I call that systemic failure because I don't focus on the plan and the trustees of the plan, because you have to look at the entire system. The plan trustees don't make all the decisions. The system, which includes legislators, it includes local governments who promise benefits, legislatures who don't properly fund benefits, and retirement trustees who don't properly account for the benefits. All that together is a systemic problem. And we have that not just CalPERS, but relevant to your discussion this morning. Let's see how the teachers are doing, because the teachers are in a separate plan. Most school non-teacher employees are in CalPERS, but the teachers themselves have a separate plan. It doesn't really look any different. It's a little bit smaller because they don't have nearly as much money. They only have a few $100 billion here and there. But the trend is the same. It's 17 years of failure. So I say to teachers, how can you be comfortable that the money is going to be there for you and your spouse for all of the rest of your life when you have 17 years of failure of not properly funding the plan? Now, at least at CalSTRS, the plan trustees can heap a little more blame on the state legislature, because for years the CalSTRS trustees were saying, we need more money. We need more money. And the legislature, it's kind of inconvenient to put more money in, so the legislature said no. Now, recently, legislatures decided more money needs to go in, but you can see the trend line is not good. It's really bad. It's, again, years and years of failure. So how about Georgia? Your plans aren't as big as CalPERS and CalSTRS, but then again, no plans are. There's a slide of CalSTRS. This looks a lot like a slide you saw this morning in Lynn's presentation, looking at the Georgia Teachers Plan. This is actually a slide of an older slide that Lynn had done, the Georgia plan, and when I go to my eye doctor, he gives me these images and says, how does this one look? How does this one look? Does this one look better? Does this one look better? And usually I can't tell the difference. So can you tell the difference? Georgia, CalSTRS, Georgia, California. Which do you prefer? They both look bad to me. My eyes maybe aren't that good, but they both look bad. So CalSTRS, Georgia TRS, you're both in trouble. You both have pensionitis, an overwhelming urge to overpromise and underfund. And I don't see how you can look at these red and these losses and not think you have pensionitis. So what do you do about it? We'll come back to reform principles, but Georgia at least had the good fortune and the good people to lead in 2009 when you did your hybrid system. And that might prove to be really, really good for Georgia. It's maybe too early to tell because we have a similar experience. You heard about Michigan this morning. 20 years ago, Michigan decided to put groups of employees into a new plan, defined contribution plan. Old employees stayed in a defined benefit plan. And so we have 20 years of experience there. And what do we know? We know that the aggregate unfunded liability in 1997 for everybody was $662 million. The funding ratio was 108%. Not bad. 1997, we'd all love to be at 108%. Well, how about today? Well, the defined contribution plan, unfunded liability is zero. They are 100% funded. So the new people can count on getting the money that they're owed, paid the benefits that they've earned. But the defined benefit plan, which the old employees are in, has a $5.5 billion in unfunded liabilities and a 66% funded ratio. So Georgia, maybe you solved your problem in 2009, maybe you didn't, time will tell. Now, all plans across the country typically say, don't worry, be happy, we're going to earn our way out of this. And if you believe that, well, you're ignoring reality because most plans have years and years and years of failure to earn their way out of it, even though they've been trying to do it for a long time. Alicia Monell, the Boston College Center for Retirement Research, did a stress test on plans across the country. And if you look at where Georgia fits in there, if we're living in a 6% rate of return world instead of a 7.5% rate of return world, and you saw the probabilities of that vary depending upon your assumptions. Lynn had a really good slide on that this morning. So you choose. If you think you're in a 7.5% world versus a 6% world, if you're in a 6% world, Georgia probably needs to increase the funding, combined funding on debt service, pension payments, and retirement benefit, retiree health care payments by 50% if it's a 6% world. So what does your future hold for you? Well, you can make your own guess as to whether you're in a 7.5% world or a 6% world. But if you're in a 6% world, you're going to put a lot more money into the plans, or you're going to run up a lot more unfunded liabilities. Now, the good news is that many states have done pension reform. Georgia had 2009 to look back on, so you kind of know how to do it. You know what it takes. Michigan, you heard about today. We have worked in many states and had some successes in some states, including bipartisan successes in some states. Arizona, correctional officers there's a ballot measure in November approving changes to the correctional officers system. Following 2 years ago, a successful ballot measure was approved for public safety, and those were approved with union support. Now, Lynn's from Arizona, so Lynn was heavily involved in Arizona. My colleague Pete Constant, who is our executive director, counted up 105 negotiating sessions and conference calls with the participants, 105 in the course of a year, in order to get the legislation crafted, to go to the legislature, get it approved by the legislature, signed by the governor, on the ballot and approved by the voters. But it can be done. Arizona is maybe unique, I hope not. I hope Arizona is a model for other places where public employee unions got engaged. They got engaged early. There was leadership from the head of the state firefighters union, because they could do the math. I'm sure Arizona is not the only place where union leaders can do math. They could do the math and they could see that their plan was on a path to failure. And you can't wait till it fails. If you do that, you're Puerto Rico. And you're paying out of current funds everything you should have paid out of contributions over 30 years. Colorado, we had a bipartisan bill. Republicans control the Senate, Democrats control the House, the governor's a Democrat. We got a bill approved, signed by the governor. Again, Colorado did some reform about 8 years ago. They came back because they didn't finish the job. That's pretty common. But it was bipartisan, and serious substantive reform can be done. Minnesota did a bipartisan reform. Pennsylvania did bipartisan reform. Now in Pennsylvania, we had both houses controlled by the Republicans. They didn't need Democrat votes to pass a bill. They had a Democrat governor. The governor vetoed a bill. They went back and took them 2 years. With Republicans controlling everything in the legislature, it took them 2 years among themselves to come up with a bill, but nevertheless they did, and the governor signed it. So I hold out the promise of not just pension reform, but bipartisan pension reform with the unions engaged in the discussion, sometimes supporting, often opposing, but nevertheless there is, I think, hope that we get leadership from the unions that are willing to engage. Now, in my case in San Jose, our unions were engaged. We had dozens of negotiating sessions, and some of the unions were willing to go along, but not publicly, because maybe you don't appreciate how hard it is for union leadership to explain to their members that they're talking about doing something that affects their benefits. That's not why they got elected. And so it's a difficult thing. It takes some courage by the union leadership as well as leadership from the top in the state. If you look across the country at pension reform, with dozens of examples, state and local, there are some characteristics that are in common. First is the leadership. We can come in and you can get a reasoned team in, we can do analysis, we can run the data, we can help with lobbying, we can help with grassroots. There are a lot of things that we do as a retirement security initiative, but the thing we cannot do is provide the leadership. Georgia, you got to do it yourselves. You have to have legislative leadership, you got to have leadership in the governor's office, you have to have some combination of leadership of people who think this is important enough to take on the fight, because it's like any big piece of legislation, it is not easy. And this one is a little more complicated because, as we heard earlier, there's an emotional component to this. It's not just analytical, and we pension geeks and budget geeks are very analytical, but there's an emotional component. We have to remember that we're tinkering with something that employees and others hold dear. So we have to be very cautious, but it takes leadership. The second thing is negotiations. I mentioned the 2 years of negotiations in Pennsylvania among the two houses. There's always negotiations. Sometimes it's between the legislature and the governor. Sometimes it's within the legislature. Sometimes it's with the unions. There's always negotiations. These are complicated things. It takes a lot of time, a lot of engagement, a lot of effort. You don't do it in a few months. It usually takes a couple of years. Opposition. There's almost always opposition. In most states, the public employees unions start with their position is just say no. It's worked for them so far. It's been a pretty good political strategy, and so that's their opening offer, is no. In fact, in California, they can say, we can't even talk to you about that because it's unconstitutional, because the legal framework in California makes it very difficult. And the union leaders say, if we talk to you about it, we'll get fired. So we're not talking to you about it. Now, we in California are waiting for the California Supreme Court to tell us whether or not the rules are what we think they are, or if they might be different. But there will be opposition. Plan for it. Probably have to litigate it. We're involved in litigation in Kentucky after their legislature approved some pension reform. We're in litigation in other states. And the thing that makes it a little bit hard is even in places where you can get the unions to agree, and they get on board, like Rahm Emanuel did in Chicago, eventually it gets litigated because these are individual rights. And each individual, not just each individual union, but in most states, there are individual rights, and they're constitutionally protected at some level in most states. And so the individuals can bring an action, as they did in Chicago. And so plan for litigation. It's an iterative process. We know from looking at the history of pension reform in state after state after state that politics is the art of the possible, that you do what you can do. You can only go so far. You do as much as you can. You get the reforms that you can. In 2009, you did a set of reforms. Now you need to do something around your teacher system to make sure it's sustainable. And that's been true in state after state. Very few states have taken on the whole thing and solved their problems in one round of reforms. Now, Utah, maybe. My colleague on the board, Dan Illenquist, was a senator in Utah when they did their pension reforms. They may have done enough in Utah so that they don't have to do it again, but they're in a minority of states. Now, there are states that don't really have a problem. It's not every state that is in trouble, just most of them are in trouble with this. It takes a long time. You don't do this in months, you do it in years. And if you get it all done in one legislative year, it's probably because you started the previous legislative year working on the issue, building the alliances, working the facts, getting the data, and doing all the things you need to do to move a major bill. There are a range of potential actions that we see across the country. The first and the most common is to do nothing and hope for the best. That's usually the public employee union's opening. That's what they want to do. That's certainly the argument, I think, today in Georgia around the teachers is, it's going to be okay. Just trust us one more year or 2 more years or maybe 10 more years. It'll be fine over the next 10 years. So that's the most common thing, but it's also the thing that is most commonly wrong. Because as you look at the history of the funding in Georgia or funding in California or funding in many, many, many other states, doing nothing just runs up the debt. Now, if you don't like debt, maybe you have one view of that. If you love debt, maybe you have a different view. And there are certainly people who love debt, and they're okay with that. I'm not one of them. I think you need to fund it as it's earned. As the promises are made, it needs to be funded, and that's one of our RSI principles. The second thing that happens most commonly is put more money into the plans. Turns out that there is no pension plan, no system that works if you don't put the money in. It's kind of a basic principle. You got to put the money in. And in almost all cases around the country, pension reforms in terms of structural changes or something for new employees goes along with putting more money into the plan, as we heard from Michigan this morning, and they're doing that in Colorado and other places because it needs more money. These plans are underfunded. The promises are at risk of being kept because they're underfunded, so you have to put more money into the plan. So you can do that by changing the funding policy, cutting services, that's really widespread. You can raise taxes, also very common. That's how we do it in California. We just raise taxes. So you could do that too in Georgia. I'm sure it's not hard to raise taxes here. You can cut government employees' pay. Now, sometimes you do it directly like we did in San Jose. Everybody takes a 10% pay cut. Nobody's happy, but everybody participates, equal pain all the way around. And sometimes you cut that pay through stagnation. And that's common in teacher systems around the country if you look at teachers' pay. and the stagnation in teachers' pay. Why is that? Well, because all of the available money is going in to pay for retirement benefits. At least that's the case in California. We pour more and more money into retirement benefits. We have less and less money to put into pay. The other thing you can do is borrowing and using gimmicks to kick the can down the road, also very popular. All you have to do, if you want models for how to do that, you just go look at Detroit, Stockton, Puerto Rico, and Chicago's about to borrow a bunch of money to put in their plans. It's not hard, borrow money. There are plenty of fools out there who'll loan it to you. But it doesn't solve your problem, it just makes the problem worse. And the third thing you can do is pension reform. So pension reform, as a technical issue, is not really that hard. I've got a table of people over there, and with Martin and a few others. I'm going to put them in a room for the next couple hours, and they're going to come out with a plan that will work for Georgia. The technical work is really not that difficult. I mean, we've done this all over the country. We have a range of plans. We know what can work and what doesn't work. So technically, it's not hard. Plan design is complicated, but it's not that difficult because we have done it before and others have gone before it. But the politics are difficult, as you know. It's the politics. One interesting thing, as a politician, is the voters actually will support pension reform if it's framed properly and presented to them, because the voters don't really want to raise taxes. They don't really want to have services cut. They like their government employees. Generally, they love their cops and their firefighters and their teachers. They like the employees. So they don't really want to cut their pension benefits or do anything that affects their benefits or do anything that makes them angry. But when given the choice of shall we raise taxes, cut services, or do pension reform, three choices, the voters will support pension reform as long as it's reasonable, reasonably fair, and solving a problem that has been well defined. Now, this is true in red states and blue states, because it doesn't really matter if you're a red state or a blue state. Pensionitis affects lots and lots of people in both categories. Republicans and Democrats alike suffer from pensionitis, but the voters, when they're well educated and understand you're trying to solve a problem and the choice is raising taxes or cutting services, they will be supportive of pension reform. So I want to turn to how to talk about pension reform, how to educate the voters on pension reform, and how to do it. First, it takes a long time. Now, one of the interesting things about San Jose that's not usually talked about in the news stories, and whether it's the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, or wherever it is suddenly we had a pension reform that was approved by the voters by nearly 70% in this blue city, in a blue county, in a blue state. Well, it didn't happen overnight. And one of the great things about being a big city mayor is that you can command media attention, and you can force the city council and everybody to pay attention to your issues. You get to set the agenda, and you have the power of the pulpit to bring people along. So when I decided that I was going to take on the fiscal issues, I did so in my very first State of the City address. Now, I was in office for 8 years. My very first State of the City address, I said that our structural budget deficit was public enemy number one. And then I stayed on that message all the way through pension reform until my last year in office. Eventually, my language, my issues, my graphics, my discussion began to permeate the media because I had to educate the media. As you know, the media's got a really short attention span. But if they hear it over and over and over and over again, it sinks in. And so eventually the media started responding to my message. I had to educate my council members. Remember, they're all Democrats and one Republican. And they had to be educated and understand that in the budget process, although we had more money, we couldn't spend it on the things they wanted to spend it on because we were going to put it into pensions. And that we were, in fact, cutting services that they wanted. So there's an education process. So it took me 6 years to get to 2012 when we put a pension reform measure on the ballot. And that was preceded by an arbitration reform measure in 2010, Another pension reform measure that was only applied to new employees in 2010, and each of those campaigns is an opportunity to educate people, to raise money, spend money, educate people. Big city mayors can do that. We can focus the media attention. It's a lot harder in a state like Georgia, where you have people spread out much bigger. You can't go door to door very well and very easily in Georgia and convince people. You can't go to every community meeting and show your slides and your graphs and make the case. So there are other ways to do it, but if you do engage the people, however it works in your state of Georgia, there are things to do. You start with the principles. I've got these here, our RSI reform principles, and you ought to start with adopting some principles. First, are you going to fund the promises or not? Yes or no? Do you think that's important, to fund your promises to your employees? If you do, well, that ought to be one of your principles. As we say in the Retirement Security Initiative, we want state and local governments to fully fund employee benefits as they are earned. If you don't fund them as they're earned, you're pushing it off onto a future generation. Maybe that's okay with you. It's certainly okay with a lot of people, but that's a principle. You're going to pay for it and when. Do you want to put your employees on a path to sustained, a secure retirement regardless of tenure? So if you don't care about the 70% of the teachers, according to the graphic from Lynn this morning, if you don't care about the 70% of teachers who leave before they vest in your pension system, well, just keep doing what you're doing because they're completely unserved by the system. If you care about them, maybe you ought to think about doing something different. But we think, regardless of tenure, if somebody works for you for 3 years or 5 years, they ought to get something towards retirement security. Because in a modern society, people move around a lot on jobs. And if we're not each contributing to retirement security, eventually people get to retirement age and don't have anything except Social Security. We think that retirement costs should be fair, benefits and costs should be fair, sustainable, and predictable. Everybody likes predictable. Unfortunately, in the pension business, you're making all kinds of assumptions over long periods of time that have proven to be wrong, so it makes it very hard to be predictable. But they should be. The cost should be predictable, as well as the benefits. And the incentives to overpromise and underfund need to be eliminated. Now, when I say there's a systemic problem in California, I can say the same thing about Georgia, because if you look at the decision makers in the system, the local officials, state officials, trustees, make a list and say, what are their incentives here? It turns out that most of the people making a decision in these defined benefit systems have an incentive to overpromise and underfund. And you need to address those incentives in a variety of ways, but you just have to realize that it's there. Unfunded liabilities should be paid down over a reasonable time. One of the things that CalPERS loved to do was have a rolling amortization. We're paying off our obligations over 30 years, and we reset that every year. So we never get to the end. Well, rolling amortizations just means you're going to underfund the plan, because you're never going to properly fund it. Decision-making needs to be open, transparent, and non-political. I know that's impossible, but they ought to be open and transparent, so at least you can figure out what the political decisions are, so people understand that. Once you have your principles, whatever they may be for your state, you need to talk about crowd out. Now, I talked about crowd out with regard to the slide, and I got more specific with some of my slides, and I'll just show you some of the slides we used in San Jose. All right, revenues are up, great, wonderful. Costs are up even more, and what's the result? Employees are down. So while we were increasing the size of government, we were shrinking the size of government. We had less employees. This is a 10-year period as we went into pension reform. So people understood that. I'm closing your library because I'm putting more money into the pension system. I'm sorry, but that's the reality. They understand that. What happened to our employees? How comes we don't have services? Well, we went from 7,400 employees down to 5,400 employees. Every one of those employees was doing something important, delivering services to people, and guess what? We don't have as many people, we don't have as many services. This graphic is only really a part of the slide. This is the police department, making the point, the budget is up, the staffing is down. We're not cutting the police department budget, we're raising the police department budget because it's our most important department, unless the fire chief's in the room. I know he's not here. So our most important department, so we're increasing the budget for the department, but we're cutting the staffing. Why is that? Because the costs for employees are going up, therefore the number of employees is going down. Those were just graphics that we used. You come up with your own graphics to explain it to your people in their own way, but it needs to be simple. But people understand the crowd out. It's harder to explain that at the state level. It's much easier at the local level, but it can be done. You just have to figure it out. Blame. Let's play the blame game because everybody loves to play the blame game. And pensions and pension reform, there's enough blame to go around. There's plenty. Hardly any sector is blameless. But as a leader and a legislator, who do you blame? Well, don't blame the public employees. They're just doing what you said they could do. They're taking the system as it was presented and expecting and accruing the benefits. It's not their fault. Don't blame the workers and don't blame the union. The union's job is to get more for their people. That's what they're doing. So who gets the blame? And it's not only deserved, but it's a safe place to put the blame is on the politicians. Because you've had 20 years of politicians over-promising and underfunding at the local level and the state level. They're easy targets. So don't fall into the game of getting into an argument about whether or not we're going to try to do something bad to the unions or bad to the employees. It's not their fault. Don't put the blame there. Don't feed the narrative that you're attacking the workers. The workers are not the cause of this problem. And don't make it easy for the opposition. Frame the objective in fairness. You're making sure people get paid what they've earned, and you're trying to be fair to the taxpayers. Taxpayers deserve a reasonable level of service for their taxes. And then you're solving a problem. The voters will be there if they understand you're solving a problem, you're being reasonably fair. There is no perfect solution, there is no fair solution, only reasonably fair because all of this stuff affects somebody in some way. So you're trying to be reasonably fair and voters will respond to that. You can see that in a national poll. We've polled it many times in California and we've certainly polled it in San Jose. You can see that in a national poll. The Reason Foundation has the Reason Rupee National Poll from February of 2015 posted on their website. And you can see the questions asked and answered and realize, yeah, we don't really want to do pension reform, but given the choice between taxes, or cutting services and raising taxes, that pension reform is something that we will support. And you can poll that locally as well. And then finally, remember that pensionitis affects Democrats and Republicans. There's no place for the Republicans to hide on this. They deserve as much of the blame as the Democrats. They've been in office. The urge to overpromise and underfund is universal. It doesn't affect everybody, but the allure of promising or giving something to your people that somebody else has to pay for, ooh, as an elected official, that's a wonderful thing. So that allure is mighty, mighty powerful to Democrats and Republicans. And then finally, you really have some choices. Cut services, cut pay, raise taxes, borrow money, or pension reform. You can go the way of Illinois, New Jersey, Connecticut, California, or you can do pension reform. So if Georgia wants to deal with this problem this year, this session, next year, next session, we're happy to participate. And we look forward to working with you as you solve your problems. Just don't do it like we did in California. Thank you all. I appreciate the chance to speak. We may have some questions. Is that right, Kyle?
Yes, that's right.
Well, as a politician, I promise to take questions. I don't promise to give answers. But I'm happy to take the questions.
Well, We'll try a few questions. The first one we had from the audience, and again, we're collecting these on note cards. If you have something that you'd like to ask Mayor Reed, just bring it up to Benita, I guess, right there, and she can get it up to me. The first one from the audience is, how much of your retirement cost increase came from people gaming the system? For example, by running up their final year's salary. Was that a big consideration, and do you see that as a big consideration in many places?
One of the things we did in San Jose as we started down the pension reform route was we had our city auditor, who's an independent auditor, can only be fired with 10 votes out of 11. So she's an independent auditor. So we had her audit the pension systems. We have two systems, one for police and fire, one for what we call federated employees. She audited both systems, and the objective was to figure out where all the cost increases came from, and there were like 11 factors in the cost increases, and she identified all those. Good numbers, good data, it's a great place to start. Having somebody who just says, okay, here's how we got to where we are today. Here was a decision made in 1992, and here's a decision made in 1997, and put numbers on each of those. So gaming the system, or spiking is the most common way of gaming it in California, is an issue, and it makes people angry, the taxpayers angry, but it tends to be a pretty small percentage of the overall problem, because not everybody can game the system and game it very well. But of course, who designed that system? Who set it up for them to game the system? Your legislators. So you created an opportunity for people to game the system. So are they gaming the system or just doing what you've offered them? But in reality, it's a relatively small number, but politically powerful. Because when you have the worst examples, those of you who are in the politics business, know that really bad examples are very good, because you can use them to make your point and you can use them to advance a political agenda. So those really bad examples are important. But as a percentage of the problem, they tend to be very small in almost all states. Because when you look at the number of people who can do it compared to the number of people in the system, there are a lot more people in the system that don't game and can't game.
The next question we got is about defined contribution plans. And the questioner says, or makes the observation that they have uncertain payouts at retirement, and asks, isn't that the key obstacle for changing from defined benefit to defined contribution plans?
First, there is not a binary choice with pension reform. So you have your Cadillac gold-plated defined benefit plan over here, like we have in California. And over here you have, your 401k kind of defined benefit plan. And in between are a whole range of options, and giving employees a choice, a blended plan, a cash balance plan, a defined benefit plan with limitations. It's really a spectrum of things that you can do. So yes, there are problems with going to a defined contribution plan, because if you look at where the risk is in the retirement system, over in the defined benefit plan, all of the risk is on the government. Defined contribution plans, a 401k kind of defined contribution, the risks and decision makings are generally shifted to the employees. But you don't have to do that. You can stop somewhere in the middle and split that risk, and risk allocation is an important thing to consider when you're designing a plan. Back to my comment about doing principles. You start, how much risk should the government take? Should the government take 100% of the risk? Should the employees take 100% of the risk? And if the answer is yes or no, then you got to do something different. Now, interestingly enough, I use this comment in Washington, D.C., and it usually gets laughs, because the federal government system for new employees is actually not a bad model for how to allocate the risks. The employees have Social Security, and so the risk is on the federal government, which from a mayor's point of view, that's great. It's on the federal government. They also have a defined benefit plan, a modest defined benefit plan with a relatively low accrual rate, which the risk is on the government, the agency that's funding it, And they have a defined contribution plan in which most of the risk is on the employees. So they've spread the risk, and that's not really a bad model. You just have to decide how you want to do the risk. But you can have a defined contribution plan that doesn't put all the burden on the employees. You can have a centrally managed, so you get the same professionals that can do defined benefit investing can do defined contribution investing. So you don't have to have the employees making all these decisions about alternative investments and gold and equities and bonds. No, you can have central management, professional people who can do a good job of that for the benefit of the employees. So it's a range. Don't assume that you only have two choices in this. The menu is much longer.
And I'm glad that question was asked because I want to put a particular Georgia spin on this. So I know from our perspective at the foundation, we don't approach this as, hey, the thing we need to do is switch from defined benefit to defined contribution. Now, how do we make that work? What our friends who work on this in many states have told us is, look, you can have a good, well-designed defined benefit plan, or you can have a bad one. The same is true of a defined contribution plan. You can design it well, you can design it poorly. The point is to get to a system that's going to provide some of that predictability, that's going to provide sustainability, security for the employee in their retirement, and that has the right design to make that work. And it's not a matter of, well, the answer is make a switch, so how do we get to there? It's start out with those principles, like Lynn mentioned this morning, like Chuck mentioned just now, and then let those principles inform where we need to go with the solution. The solution may be relatively small changes to the existing system. It may be a kind of hybrid system. We're not starting out with that end in mind. So I want to make that point very clear to echo what Chuck and Lynn have said this morning is we want to let the data and the evidence and good principles guide that work. Please join me in thanking Chuck for that wonderful speech. Stick with this one. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be back with our education segment.